Okay, Annie Tulkin, hello.
Morning.
I'm glad you could join me today.
So happy to be with you, Adam.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So we had a little introductory call about this call some time ago, and it seemed like there was a lot to discuss today. Um, so I thought what we could do is we could start by just introducing ourselves each, and then we'll talk about why we're here, and then we can get right into questions. What do you say? Why don't you go first?
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. I'm Annie Tulkin. I am the founder and director of Accessible College. At Accessible College, we support students with physical disabilities, health conditions, and sensory impairments with the transition to college. So that might be students who use mobility devices or who use wheelchairs, also students with different types of health conditions. So things like Crohn's disease, autoimmune disorders, POTS, cancer, lupus, and then also students with sensory impairments. So students who have visual impairments and hearing impairments or who are deaf or blind. And we work with a lot of students who have comorbid conditions. So they might have a health condition and a visual impairment or a physical disability and a mental health condition, things like that. So the reason that we do that is because colleges provide varying levels of supports and accommodations. And so it's really important that students understand the differences between what they may have received in high school and what college will look like in terms of the accommodation process. And so that's what Accessible College does. We support students and families, guide them through that process.
That is excellent work that you're doing, Annie. That is really exciting. It's kind of when we got to know each other, I had the impression that I had met the missing link. Uh, so we work mostly with accessibility coordinators, right, at colleges and universities, community colleges, and but of course the end user of all of our services is are the deaf and hard of hearing students. So it's so exciting to see that somebody's filling that gap and helping with that transition through right up until the moment where we come in contact with those young people. So very exciting stuff. Um,
Absolutely. And Adam, what did you want to touch on today?
well, I'll just do a little intro about Karasch and Associates. So Karasch and Associates, otherwise known as Karasch.com, is a family-run business. I'm Adam Karasch, so I'm the CEO and the second generation of the business. My parents started this company 40 years ago, and I've been running it now for 4 or 5 years. So where what we do and what we've always done is transcription, captioning, and a number of other services. And really the entire accessibility division of the firm is really focused on the mission of providing excellent services. But what we've morphed into in the context of this call is really solving problems for accessibility coordinators, and at the end of the day, solving problems for deaf, hard of hearing, and in some cases blind young people who are going through their college experience or have just been employed, et cetera. So a whole spectrum of accessibility services, captioning, CART, transcription, note-taking, but also American Sign Language, and a couple of others that'll be relevant to today's discussion. So in some sense, maybe there's that transition is kind of a handoff. So where you begin, maybe we end in the sense that if you guide the people that you help correctly, then right as soon as they sign up for a class, they should be able to get the proper service with excellent quality if they follow the steps that you and perhaps I are able to put forth today during our call. So
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of pieces that students and families just aren't really aware of
yeah,
in that transition to college in terms of what students have to take on. And so we'll definitely touch on that today when we're talking.
excellent, excellent. Yeah, you had asked me previously, kind of, to give an overview of what it is we're going to be talking about today. So I'll touch on a couple of, what's and whys. So the subject of today's call is really focused on the deaf, the hard of hearing, deaf and hard of hearing communities. So as you said, this interesting moment is this transition from the high school reality, usually before they're 18, to this adult reality when they're kind of on their own, and the ADA still applies, but in a much different way. They really have to take care of themselves, show a lot of initiative, sometimes in cooperation with their accessibility coordinator and or their parents. So this is meant to target really three people. It's meant to target, from my perspective, the accessibility coordinators, and from your perspective, perhaps the young people, right? The deaf and the hard of hearing individuals who are leaving high school and moving to college. And I think as well, the parents of the deaf and hard of hearing individuals who've really, they're letting that child out from under their umbrella, and maybe they want to help them along the path. So why it's relevant today and why we're really talking about it is that we see, I see, at least from my end, that a lot of the deaf and hard of hearing students still sign up for classes, but they won't be in full communication with their accessibility coordinators. And when they're not, that means that they're leaving, they're really opting out of the rights that they have to excellent service, to being on a level playing field with the fully hearing students. So what I'm hoping we can achieve today is to really raise awareness so that deaf and hard of hearing young people really get out there and take advantage of all the amazing rights they have. So I guess as we move into your into a question I've got for you, yeah. I'm hoping that by the end of this call, what we can do, Annie, is we can draw out something like a roadmap for young people that are finishing college or finishing high school now, and they're applying for colleges, or they're getting in, and they're going to be starting in September. And so I'm hoping that by watching this video, they can get some basic questions answered about what they need to do, when they need to do it, and why.
Yeah, it's percolating in my brain as you're talking to. So many things have emerged. Yeah.
Well, delve into it a little bit. Tell me about the problems of the transitioning student, the navigation that they have to expect, what they should do, and
Sure. So there's a couple pieces, and I wanted to kind of do a terminology check, as it were. So you're using the term accessibility coordinator, and I'm sure there are some families out there who are scratching their heads and saying, what's an accessibility coordinator? So when a student is in high school, if they're in a public school, the law that applies is IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And another law that applies is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And that's an anti-discrimination act. IDEA provides supports and services for students with disabilities. So that could be things like extra time on tests for students who have a learning disability or who take medication that gives them brain fog, or it could be a sign language interpreter or CART in a classroom, or it could be occupational therapy or speech therapy in terms of the services component. So there's kind of a range of the types of accommodations and services that a student might get in the kindergarten through 12th grade setting. When a student transitions to college, IDEA no longer applies. It switches over to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it doesn't matter how old the student is, it's when they matriculate. So when they sign that dotted line and say, I'm going to X university, that's when that kind of kicks in. And the ADA is a little bit different than IDEA. So the ADA provides reasonable accommodations, and I'm using air quotes because reasonable accommodations leaves a lot of kind of judgment on the school side to determine what is reasonable in that school setting. So when I was saying earlier that colleges and universities really vary in the types of accommodations they will provide, I meant that. They vary from school to school. And so that's why it's really important for students to do their homework as they're exploring different colleges and universities, whether it's a vocational school or a community college or a four-year university. It's really important to connect with the Disability Support Office while you're doing your college search. So prior to your application, absolutely once you've been accepted, so that you can see what types of accommodations they may or may not provide a student who has a hearing impairment or a visual impairment or any condition really. And so kind of thinking about that, each college has a disability support office. It might have a different name. And so some of them are called academic resource centers. Some of them are called student disability services, accessibility services. It could be any of these things. I used to be the associate director of the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University, and that's Georgetown's Disability Support Office. So the word disability is not even in the title of the office at all. And so one of the things that students and families can do is go to the school's website and just put in the search terms of like disability and students, and that'll usually bring up the office. So you can see, you know, what the office offers. You go to that office's website and you'll see they'll outline a process for requesting accommodations. Now, this is where things are very, very different from high school. So usually in high school, mom and dad can be a part of that process. You know, your teachers are talking to your parents and letting your parents know, you know, what you might need in the classroom, what services or accommodations might best support you. But in college, the student has to be the one to self-disclose their disability. So even if you wrote your essay, your college essay about, you know, being deaf and living in the town you live in, the disability office, the one that provides accommodations, doesn't know. So the application process is distinctly separate from the accommodations process. And that's on purpose so that there is no discrimination in that process, right? So the student has to self-disclose their disability to the disability support office. And usually that means, you know, having a conversation with a counselor in the disability support office. And then the next pieces would be providing documentation of a disability. So for someone who's deaf or hearing impaired, that could be an audiology report. It might also be, you know, a letter from your healthcare provider. Most colleges won't accept an IEP, an individualized education plan or program, or a 504 plan as primary documentation. So that means
that comes as a huge shock typically to students, doesn't it? They think that it's going to be the same documentation right on through, and it's not.
You are absolutely right. And the other thing that shocks people is that the accommodations might not be exactly the same either.
Right.
So the things that you may have received in high school, you might not receive in college. So that's, again, where it's important to be having those conversations with disability support offices while you're searching, while you're choosing your school, trying to figure out what's going to be the best and most supportive fit for you.
And your needs may change. So you may find that by the time you're 18, 19, 20, and you're in the college setting, that you are more independent than you were before, or perhaps because of your specific disability, you're less independent and your needs have changed. It's very important to be in open dialogue with the counselors.
You know, and you mentioned earlier too that it was a little bit of a slip, but the transition to employment, which is I think this is a perfect time too to also talk about the fact that as you're going through this process with the disability support office, with that accessibility coordinator, this would be a similar process to what you'd be doing with HR in an employment setting, right? Exactly. So if you needed to request an accommodation in the workplace, it's basically the same thing. You have to go to the HR person, request the accommodation. So by requesting the accommodation, you have to know what your needs are. You have to be able to effectively communicate what those needs are. And then you also have to provide documentation of that need. It's the same thing. So in a sense, this college process is a little bit of a training ground for what students may experience once they join the workforce as well.
I couldn't agree more. This a little bit later in this meeting, we'll get into the whole concept of self-advocating and self-disclosure, which I think are the key points in this call. And really, that's where there's this dichotomy for a lot of people. They find it's difficult to do that, or they feel embarrassed. We've found as well, the counselors will tell us that students were embarrassed, to come and self-disclose. They didn't have to before, now they have to. But we'll get into that a little bit later. I wanted to address the employment component. So the reason I mentioned that is because Karasch and Associates runs a series called ADA Compliance in Practice. And so we bring in different specialists. The two that we've been doing lately is ADA compliance for educators and ADA compliance for HR generalists and specialists. So it's exactly that. It's for people who are entering the workforce and for people who are entering, the college setting and higher education. And so we do that in cooperation with a law firm that specializes in this space. And so we walk through different scenarios and case studies, legal case studies of schools and employers that have not provided reasonable accommodations and what happens when they don't. Very interesting. So we get a lot of calls after those ADA compliance webinars about that, like, oh, we didn't know there were such stiff penalties for not providing, these types of accommodations. So I think that's a good segue to really tell students and young people that, you're the one who has the rights. The law is on your side. So if you can be specific about advocating for yourself, if you can be accurate with your timing and with your requirements, you'll find a very good environment for getting what you need.
Well, and just digging a little bit into that, because
Yeah.
when a student's in high school, so much of this is done for them. Like their schedule
Yes.
is mapped out for the year. Somebody's making the request. Somebody knows, if they need a sign language interpreter, they know the interpreter to request, the person who's like the best fit for them because they use signed English or whatever the thing might be. But in college, it's a whole new game.
That's
So typically when a first year student starts at college, they might start to choose their classes. Either, it depends on the school. So this is a wide range. They might do that choice in like July and have their meeting with their advisor and set up a schedule. Or it might be like the week before classes start in the fall, right? So right off the bat, that's a really challenging thing, because if you only have a week turnaround time to get everything in place, there will likely be bumps in that road.
Yep.
So usually what I encourage students to do is, once you know what school you're going to, May 1st, you sign that dotted line. Then the next day you pick up the phone or you shoot an email to the disability support office and you tell them you want to start the process to request accommodations.
Exactly.
Because it might take some time. And also, you might also need to request housing accommodations. And we'll put a little pin in that to talk about what the needs might be there. But it can take a little bit of time. And then you might also want to ask your advisor, who would be like a person in your program. So let's say you're studying biology. You might have a specific advisor in the School of Science who's advising you on what classes to take. You would probably want to connect with that person and say, I'm deaf, or I have a hearing impairment and I'm going to need CART, or I'm going to need a sign language interpreter. So could we, do priority registration and choose my classes earlier? And that's another type of accommodation that a lot of students who are deaf or hearing impaired or visually impaired might want to request, is priority registration, so that they can choose their classes before other students and hopefully get their schedule set a little bit earlier.
That's a great point. That's a great point. A lot of the counselors actually come to us after the drop ad, and they're telling us that these young people are still deciding, and that's their right to do that. But at the end of the day, they're falling behind in comparison to other students just because they didn't take those extra steps before the other students. They didn't take advantage of the rights that they have.
Yeah, I mean, so just like kind of laying it out, we know that 19% of undergraduate students receive accommodations, and that's students with learning disabilities, students with chronic health conditions, mental health conditions, physical disabilities. So there's a large number of students who receive accommodations. The portion of those students who have a sensory impairment, who are blind or visually impaired, is even, or deaf or hearing impaired, is a fraction of that population. The highest numbers of students have learning disabilities, and the area where we're seeing the most growth is mental health conditions. So students who have anxiety or depression that also have a functional limitation, so that their condition prevents them from being able to do something. So in most colleges, there aren't a ton of students who have a hearing impairment or who are deaf. So that's the other piece of this puzzle, is that the numbers are much lower. So the disability support office, depending on the school, might not be as savvy on how to navigate these issues. So that's another piece of this puzzle. If you're going to like a larger state school, a lot of state schools, have sign language interpreters and CART people on staff. But for most universities, they are hiring out to people like you, Adam.
That's right.
So they're networking with a company to provide those services on campus, which takes a lot of logistics to set up. And I agree with you. It is kind of unfair that students have to be more prepared and have to like have those classes in place, because their peers who are hearing don't have to manage that same process. But that's why it could be beneficial to do some of that work up front in the summertime with the advisor and with your disability support office, so that you can have a little bit easier time navigating.
And with us, to be honest. I was going to say, and with you, with your team, and with my team. So that's really where I'd like to raise and wave a flag here, is that you're not alone. If you have questions, if the advisor or the accessibility director or counselor at your school that you're coordinating with is having issues or stumbling blocks, they don't know how to help you as well as they would like to, because they all want to help. It's just a question of technicalities, logistics. Sometimes they don't know how, or they're overloaded helping a lot of students at the same time. That's where you can reach out to us and our 24/7 tech team, and we'll set up everything remotely, and we'll advise for free, and the school, and you. So it's all you have to do is ask, really, and ask at the right time in order to be on a level playing ground with your peers.
Yeah, and I think I've heard of these circumstances, like when I worked in a disability support office, we had contracts with companies to contract out for these pieces, but there are still schools out there who have not had a deaf student, or who have not had a student who's hearing impaired and needs CART. And so it also takes time on the school side to set up a contract. The universities, colleges are a lot like the government in that the wheels are quite slow. And so the earlier that students can indicate that they have this need, the better off they'll be, because then they'll be able to put things in place and make sure they have what they need.
That's exactly right. Some schools we find actually are forced to go through a procurement process, and which is fine. We do that all the time. So it's not a problem for us, but what it may mean for you as an end user, or for you as an accessibility coordinator, whoever you happen to be, it might mean delays and additional complications at the last minute that you hadn't forecasted, in your schedule. It could delay things. So you really want to take advantage of the time that you have when you have it.
And for me, this kind of brought something to mind, that students might be used to having an in-person sign language interpreter.
Right.
But depending on the school that you go to and where that's located and the topic area of what you're studying too, right?
Yep.
That might not be an option. So students might also have to adjust to having video remote interpreting in the classroom. So that's another kind of piece of this. So even if you request a physical sign language interpreter in your class, you might get something else. And that's that idea of reasonable accommodation.
Right.
The other piece of that too is like, depending on the technical nature of whatever the course is about, CART might be the thing that's provided as opposed to a sign language interpreter. And sometimes it's challenging for students, rightfully so. And this is where your role as a student, coming back to that disability support office and explaining why something isn't working for you,
Right.
or why you need to have what you requested, is going to be critically important.
Yes.
And I wanted to mention too, Adam, that there's an organization called the National Deaf Center, and their website is just nationaldeafcenter.org, and they have a ton of resources and research on deaf students in higher education that people might be interested in checking out. So I wanted to make sure that we mentioned that today.
Excellent. I'm glad you did. This whole concept of self-advocacy and self-disclosure is very important. So we've talked about this now a couple times, but it's important when we're talking in the context of remote services as opposed to on-site services. So as we all know, the world has gone completely remote. And it's probably not going to get back to normal anytime very soon. And this applies most definitely to you as a deaf or hard of hearing or blind individual, because a lot of services that used to be provided on site are provided remotely now. And this ties in directly to your wish to self-disclose or not, or if you don't want to self-disclose, if you don't want other students that you're with in the classroom really to know that you're a beneficiary of these services, these additional services, and whether that's right or wrong, I won't even get into that, because it's in every sense it's your right to have these services, but we understand the feeling of not wanting to self-disclose so blatantly. A remote service allows you to keep that to yourself. What's going on is on your screen. The interaction with the captioner or with the ASL provider is really happening on your screen. It's happening remotely, and the only people who know about it really are you, the interpreter, and perhaps the professor who's teaching the class. So that allows for a buffer of privacy, really. And so that's an additional advantage, I think, that not everyone considers when thinking about remote versus on-site services.
I would also say that I think most students don't realize that so many students receive accommodations. So like when you look around your classroom, if there's 25 people in there, there's at least a handful of other students who are receiving accommodations for whatever things that they need.
Yep.
And so I think like kind of talking about this more reduces the stigma of it, and so the more open conversations we can have about these needs, the better. And also lots of colleges are turning more towards a universal design for learning approach, right? So there are some places that might automatically record and caption all of their classes. So if that's something that you think you'll need, maybe that's a search feature that you want to try and look for as you're exploring different universities too. That's the other side of that.
Another one I would add to that is the whole concept of note taking. So as we know, CART captioning is happening in real time as the class is happening. You're seeing the 99, 98% accurate transcript coming up on your screen as it's happening in real time. But the byproduct of that, or a totally separate product, can be notes, notes in all different types of formats. And we're finding that some schools and some students with all different types of disabilities or difficulties are finding that notes after the class are very helpful. So that's another opportunity, that might be simpler in a lot of ways because an audio recording is sufficient to do that.
Well, and it's important too to know that like notes, the way that notes are done is very different from school to school. So some schools might use kind of an AI technology and capture something that captures and then writes it out and give that to the students. other schools hire another student in the class
Right.
to take notes and just give their notes to the disability support office, who then gives them to the students who need them. So
Right.
there's kind of different approaches now to how note taking is done.
We're
And so
finding
that
a lot of schools are trying to step away from having other students do the notes. It's nice and it's quaint and it gives the other students a chance to make a couple bucks, but what we miss there is consistency and accuracy. Whereas if you're bringing in a vendor like ourselves that do this every day for thousands of schools, then you know you get a certain guarantee of accuracy. And when you're asking one of the peers to do it, you don't really know what type of accuracy you're going to get or what format you're going to get. And so that's important. Consistency is very important. It's a little bit like with ASL interpreting. We find that consistency is a major issue with young people when they just use any old agency, right? They're getting kind of a different ASL interpreter for.
I thought you just meant like in general.
No, not in general, for classes. So if you have a biology class or something and you get a different interpreter for every class or every other class, then you lose that rapport and that consistency, and therefore you have to relearn things and you have to relearn vocabulary, and it's a barrier.
Well, speaking of young people and life and consistency, one of the other things that I don't feel like a lot of people really understand when they transition to college is that a couple things. If you're living on campus, then accommodations aren't only for academics. This is something that's like critical for people to get. It applies to dormitories, right. residence halls, dormitories, whatever we're calling them nowadays. It also applies to any like on-campus events or a speaker, or a thing that's happening on campus. So one of the things that I always encourage students to do is to think through their whole day and some of the things that they might need throughout the day in order to figure out what's that going to look like when I'm living in a dorm. Where this comes up a lot for students who are deaf or hearing impaired is around emergency management. So most dormitories at least have a strobe light inside the room. Now, the critical question is, does a strobe wake you up in the middle of the night, right? Or do you need to have a bed shaker or another type of solution so that if there is an emergency situation, which in college happens all the time, people burn pizzas in the ovens and there's fire alarms and whatever. So, thinking through those types of components. Also, when you're touring a school, going and seeing, if they have event flyers up, does it have a little script on the bottom that says, if you need an accommodation, contact this person, right? Because they're not automatically, unless some schools do this, but they're not usually not automatically having a sign language interpreter for an event or a speaker. It's usually something you have to request. So you want to make sure that you're actually able to fully engage in the things that the college has. I would also ask the disability support office what would happen if you wanted to join a club or an activity, because there are some schools who will only provide accommodations like sign language interpreters for the academic things and not for clubs or other activities. And that could be a deciding factor for a student in whether or not they want to attend that university, right? So so those are the types of things that you want to be thinking through and looking for when you're connecting with the disability support offices. Also seeing if there's other deaf or hearing impaired students who are currently on campus and asking if you can be connected with them to hear about their experience, because who knows better than the people who are living it right now, right? Like, so that's another way to kind of get the information that you might be seeking when you're looking into a college.
Excellent. Those are all good thoughts. Okay, well, listen, Annie, I'm thinking that we could probably go on like this for another 3 hours, and I'm sure we'd find a lot of other interesting things to talk about. But what I think we should focus on for the next couple of minutes before we close up is what I mentioned at the beginning of the call, is to try to present what we could call a journey or a path for this young person who is trying to select a school, or they've chosen a school, and what to do when. So it's currently June. This will be getting out into the world very soon. And why don't you start, and then I'll finish.
Yeah, well, so if you're starting college in the fall, you want to contact the Disability Support Office now if you haven't already done that. Because then you can start that process of handing in the documentation. They call it the interactive process. It takes time because sometimes it can take the school, depending on the size of the school, up to 3-4 weeks to even look at your documentation. And so you want to get started as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a junior in high school or a rising senior in high school, and you're starting to explore campuses and think about your college applications, which you should be because they're going to be due soon in September.
Mm-hmm.
Now is the time that you're probably going on college tours. Something to think about in terms of college tours is also requesting accommodations for the tour. You can do that. There might not be a spot on that admissions website because some schools are not as good at that as others, but you can request a sign language interpreter for a tour. Right. You can request CART. You can ask them if they're showing a video, does it have CART on the bottom? Just so that you can see it. Captioning, that's the word I was looking for. Does it have captioning on the bottom? You can ask all those questions. You can ask for a one-on-one tour if you think it would be easier so that you don't have to stand in the back of a group of 20 people, whatever. You need to just contact the admissions office. Right. When you're going on that tour, you might also want to contact the Disability Support Office and set up a time to have a conversation with them about, your needs and about what it might look like for you to go to school there, what that process is, what types of accommodations they might give you. So that's kind of like where those are students who are thinking about school or starting school in the fall. Then there's this whole other group of students, right? So starting to think about building those self-advocacy skills early as possible. And some of that too is just like mom and dad giving your student a little bit more leeway so that your student can start to make their doctor's appointments. Your student can start to manage their own medication. Your student is an active part in that IEP process, very much at least being present at the meeting, maybe right. Even preparing a few questions or comments of their own so that they can offer that, starting to work on those self-advocacy skills. Your students also in college going to have to go and talk to each professor about their needs. So starting that in high school, right? So maybe creating a script, going up to their teachers, having conversations about what their needs are, what they'd prefer, what they'd like to see in that classroom. That gets them a little bit more comfortable with doing it once they're living independently. So there are some things that families can start to do to get ready and prepare for that. And I think the other key piece here is like finding your tribe. That's where this will be my final point. It's like finding your tribe. So, I mentioned the National Deaf Center earlier. There are lots of other resources too. I know that, Gallaudet has resources, and I think RIT has some other resources right. too, but finding those groups of people, seeking out, other deaf students or hearing impaired students who have made it through college and like reading or learning about what their experiences were and the things that they wish they knew can really help inform your process and experience too, either as a parent or as a student or as an educator who works with deaf and hearing impaired students. So that's what I think is really, really critical and really helpful for
those
for
are
students.
All great thoughts, Annie. I would just add a couple maybe points to that, is that along the way you might be asking yourself, what is available out there? What can I do better than I've done before? What accommodations are available to me that maybe I haven't thought of or taken advantage of before? How do I do this remotely? What are the challenges I'm going to face, and how can I avoid some of those problems ahead of time by planning appropriately? So that's the ideal time to reach out to me and my team, or to Annie, I'm sure, and to ask us about what other students like you do. We'll talk about what your needs are. We'll talk about who you are and what you're used to. We'll talk about where you're going. It might very well be an institution that we're already aligned with, because we work with schools in all 50 states and a lot of international work as well. So we may very well have worked with them already or currently do. So just reach out to us. We don't mind. We're happy to help and happy to talk. And we've been doing it for 40 years. So just reach out, use the resources that you have available to you. Two of those resources are here on this call, and we'll be happy to steer you in the right direction if we can't answer your questions for whatever reason.
Well, and Adam, if people are interested in finding me, I'm at accessiblecollege.com, and I'm also on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, all of the things, Instagram.
Right.
So there's many, many ways to connect. And if you go to the website, you can find links to all of those things. So if people are interested in connecting, go
Excellent.
to
I'll be showing it. I'll be adding its access contact details to the both of us under this video as well, and all the different formats that it'll be presented. So no worries there. But you can also reach me at adam@karasch.com. So very simple. It's my name that's on the screen, adam@karasch.com, or you can go to our website, which is karasch.com. And you can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook, and we're also on Twitter and all of the platforms and YouTube, etc. So reach out to us via chat on our website or through social media, or just give me a call and or send me an email. So I'm really glad you could all join us today. I'm super glad that you and I, Annie, had the chance to sit down and talk. And I think we'll be doing this again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Adam.
All right. See you very soon. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.